Great to see such a turnout for this event today, and so glad so many of my colleagues in the media could make this session as well. Before we get started, I just want to make a quick public service announcement. If there are any Pokemons in the room right now, please capture them and take them outside. We don't need the disruptions. Seriously though, we don't have much time today. The session's going to be about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So I'm going to get started quite quickly so we can cover as much ground as possible. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. On my far left, I'd like to introduce the person whose surname I'm really going to try to pronounce correctly, and that's Bora Varilaci. Is that correct?
Not far, Bora Varliaci, but I often get Varliaci, so...
Bora, I'll use your first name if you don't mind. Bora is head of Africa Digital Infrastructure at Mott MacDonald, which is a specialist consultancy. Next to Bora is Rian Graham. Rian is head of Sub-Saharan Africa at Ruckus Wireless, which of course is a Wi-Fi infrastructure expert. And on my immediate left, Luke McKend is the MD of Google South Africa. I'm told Luke's company has something to do with the internet, so I'm really glad he's on the panel today.
It's a small startup.
Right, let me just say a few words before we get kicked off. You know, it's a tough time for Africa's economies at the moment. South Africa is on the brink of a recession, largely of its own creating. Nigeria and Angola are under severe pressure because of the collapse in oil prices. Generally, the story of Africa rising, the famously illustrated in an Economist cover story a couple of years ago, is looking a little battered. But one bright spot does seem to be telecommunications and ICT more broadly. In South Africa, you can drive just about anywhere in any of the major cities, admittedly the upmarket parts of those cities, and see people at work digging trenches and running fibre. I think I drove past 3 FTTH installations in progress on my way to this event this afternoon. Wi-Fi initiatives are bringing connectivity to some of the areas that aren't getting fibre. And elsewhere on the continent, the mobile operators are hard at work. Fibre is also being rolled out. Places like Lusaka and Nairobi are getting FTTH broadband. And the backhaul networks are already there to a large extent, or are being built. The subsea cable infrastructure is in place, yet more cables are still coming. And companies like Liquid Telecom are building cross-continent fibre infrastructure. So we are getting places, despite the state of the economies across the continent. But the question is, what will the impact be of all of this investment? And also, what's not going right? I can think of spectrum allocation in South Africa, for one thing. We've all seen the World Bank numbers on the impact of internet access on GDP growth. But what sort of digital economy is Africa going to build on top of these networks? And perhaps most importantly, do we have the skills to take advantage of the opportunity? So with that said, I'd like to ask my panelists to jump in. Guys, I'd like to keep this quite an informal session. So if you want to jump in, please do at any time. We'll be quite quick, as I said, about 25 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be opportunity for audience Q&A. So please think of some questions. But based on the brief conversations I had with the panelists ahead of the session today, I want to start the session by talking about skills and about education. And Rian, I know you have some strong views on this, that you're very concerned about the state of education, particularly here in South Africa and in the continent more broadly, and what it means. Do we have a crisis?
Well, I think if we don't address the issues at hand, yes, we will have. It's very simple. Today, we're sitting in South Africa specifically. We're sitting with close to 27,000 schools. Most of them have got zero ICT servicing or availability at the schools. If you have a look at the students that finish grade 12, they go on to further education, and then eventually entering the work environment. Are we empowering them with the right skills to be able to contribute to the economy? I don't think we are. Do we put down the framework, for instance, at schools? Do we ensure that there's decent ICT connectivity at the schools to enable them to start working, utilizing tools and software applications, etc., which will be required for them in the future years? I think there's a lack. Unfortunately, I think there's a lack of coherence between the private sector and government at large. I think there needs to be pretty much a rewrite of the framework with regards to ICT services in education at large, from grassroots all the way up to further education. And there needs to be a concerted effort both from government side as well as from general business, as to how do we build a system that can build doctors, engineers of the future. Every year that we stagnate and we don't address this issue properly, okay, we're putting ourselves in danger of falling further behind. So to me, I feel it's we need a lot of hard work, for sure.
So what's the practical solution, though? I mean, the industry has been saying this for years. How does the industry work with the government to raise what the challenges are and start to actually deal with them? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this over the years. What practical steps can actually be taken now to address this
Well,
problem?
I think there needs to be a collective panel. And again, you need to start at the grassroots level and identify what is required from a governmental level. What do they deem to be necessities from different age groups, from an ICT skills perspective? And then with business, we need to sit down with them, with government, and understand, right, how do we build this? Because it's not something you can just, with a flick of a switch, enable. But I think there needs to be a clear roadmap. There needs to be a clear vision. And I think we're lacking that currently, nationally.
Yeah, yeah. Right, Luke, I know that Google's recently announced quite an exciting initiative around the whole skills development area for Africa. Maybe you can just talk a bit about what the company is doing there. And while you're answering that question, perhaps you could just provide your insights onto just how bad the skills gap is on the continent and what can be done about it, more broadly.
Yeah, so we announced recently that we were going to train 1 million young people in Africa on basic digital skills. So it's quite an ambitious project. I did the math, and it meant at the time of launch, we were going to do this in a year, that we had to train, sort of over 3,000 people a day on average. So quite a substantial and, like I say, ambitious project. We're trying to do this with a number of different partners, and it's delivered both face-to-face and to some extent online, which of course presupposes that some of these students or some of the people who go through the course are online in the first place, which of course is a problem, as we've just discussed. But nonetheless, it's a way for us to scale as fast as possible. And I think Google has for a long time believed that the internet is a real driver for economic growth wherever it is, and particularly in Africa and in South Africa, we've seen that a number of studies have indicated that businesses in particular that simply have a digital presence are in fact both more profitable and employ more people than businesses that don't have a digital presence. We haven't exactly established what the causality is there, but the fact of the matter is that if you have some sort of digital savvy within that particular business, you tend to do a lot better. And as a result, we thought, how can we make a contribution to this particular ecosystem? So hence the Million Person Project was born. It actually started from a slightly smaller project that we were running in Johannesburg that was looking at bringing in more digital skills into the advertising agency community. And I mention that only because it highlights some of the skills gap. What typically tends to happen in agency world, where a lot of the time, it's the coalface of the digital interface with consumers. They're actually producing that content. What they were discovering is that the graduates they hire often don't have the skills that they need. So not only do we have a digital skills gap in the sort of the most basic sense, but we have a digital skills gap even with those that go through our university system and our tertiary education systems. They simply weren't equipped to contribute immediately to the kind of campaigns they need to be developing. And as a result, we put people through a 3-month boot camp, non-university graduates in most cases, and the experience was that they were more able to contribute to the campaigns and to the clients that they were servicing than those that actually had university degrees. And I think the problem is it speaks to how quickly the digital environment is changing the game, both in general and how we interact with media, but also in business. And if you can't react much more quickly than we currently do, you're going to miss the boat. In all sorts of different respects. And education takes such a long time to change. We need to be far more responsive to those needs.
So I want to maybe just follow up on that. I guess universities give you a good grounding in an education. They're never really going to provide the sort of specific skill sets that that employers are looking for, but it does provide you the ability for continuous learning. But can you talk a little bit more through this initiative, what type of skills you're going to be developing on this continent? Is it Google technology-specific skills, or are you going to be trying to create talent that can work in the entire technology ecosystem?
No, not necessarily Google specific. I think it's much more important that people have a general sense of how to use the digital world. So a good example would be, for instance, what we find with many young people at the moment is that pretty much everybody has some form of digital footprint. Whether you've posted onto social media, tweeted, left a comment or a review, you have some form of digital footprint. But very few young people, and you'll see this possibly with your kids or with others that you try and employ, have a sense of what's a good thing to leave behind. So imagine for a moment, you're a young person who is about to apply for their first job, and your potential employer has a look at your digital footprint. That is really the first step in terms of having some basic set of digital skills, is actually managing that digital footprint so that you leave behind things that people may want to actually see. So some of the skills, we're actually starting at that really basic level, is how do you as an individual manage your own digital footprint? Once you've done that, you can start to see how those skills might be transferable in a business environment. So then we move more to how do you actually use digital to promote your small business potentially, and that could be anything from creating a website that people can engage with, making sure that it's mobile centric. And I think that's the thing that many businesses miss at the moment, is that most of the traffic that they're seeing and the increase in traffic is mobile. Building for desktop is just a stupid idea,
especially in Africa.
Well, if 80% of your traffic in Nigeria is coming from mobile devices, building a desktop site is probably not a good thing. So those are the kind of skills that we'll be looking to develop. And of course, there are a number of Google products that can help to support that, but people don't always only use Google, unfortunately, when they're online.
So I'd like to bring Bora into the discussion now and perhaps move it on a little bit. A lot of the digital revolution that we're talking about in Africa, or anywhere in the world for that matter, is predicated on internet access and cheap broadband more specifically. Has enough been happening in South Africa and in Africa more broadly to get people connected? Have governments helped or hindered?
Well, the things have been happening in Africa. As you start the conversation with, within the last 6 years, we have seen, first of all, arrival of more and more submarine cables, which is bringing the international connectivity to the continent. Then we have seen the terrestrial fibre reach more than doubling from 400,000 kilometers in 2010 to today over 1 million kilometers on the continent. We have seen creation of new business, more infrastructure sharing. We have seen emergence of tower companies, for example, which is enabling much easier or cost-efficient delivery of these services, and lots of other open access providers from data centers to networks. So things have been happening, and the things have been happening fast. But the question is it enough? Probably not. And whether governments are doing enough. The governments and industry in general, I may say, needs to better cooperate and coordinate and collaborate on these issues. Because today, one aspect of connectivity or getting more broadband penetration going in a continent is about supply side, which is about the networks. But the other important component is the demand side of the things. And on the supply side, I think it's the general concern that we don't have sufficient reach of access networks yet, and there are reasons behind that in terms of resource and availability from spectrum and other aspects. But on the demand side, do we do really enough? And demand side, not necessarily only about affordability and the content, really awareness, making this interesting for the people, which goes into education as well, very basic end-user skills to attract interest to reaching broadband. I don't think, enough coordination is going on the demand side, or enough focus is being put on the demand side of the things where the gaps are. I guess, we really need to, as an industry, government, private sector, industrial associations, and NGOs, we really need to look into how we holistically go about it, and if there is a service available, how do we ensure that this is being demanded and used properly by the people? I think that's where the gaps are today.
Okay. Or just following up on that, I'd like to ask you to take this next question as well. Luke was saying this is a mobile-first or almost a mobile-only continent. There's no doubt that it's the mobile operators that have really driven access for consumers. Is that going to continue to be the case into the future, or do you think we're going to see alternative infrastructure providers coming in to provide solutions. I'm thinking of things like white spaces, TV white spaces, spectrum. I'm thinking about Wi-Fi providers and other alternative technologies. Do you think those are going to play more of a role over the next decade than they have in the past? Or do you think the mobile operators are going to be the ones who continue to deliver mobile broadband or broadband generally to consumers on this continent?
I believe, I mean, there will be lots of new service providers coming on the market. I mean, to start with, a very recent example in South Africa, on the fibre space, we never thought South Africa would see fibre to the home. And start 2 years ago with a very innovative business model, open access, very affordable connectivity. I mean, affordable, you know, within the context of what was available before. And we have seen today more than 100,000 houses passed on FTTH alone just in 2 years. And if the funding was available, probably the number would be growing much faster today. So, and on the continent, we have already seen emergence of alternative service providers, particularly on the back of when the digital dividend spectrum becomes available, the LTE service providers. On the continent, we have seen this in Uganda, Ghana, and many other places. New LTE service providers are emerging, and it is much easier today. Because in the past, getting in the mobile business was really capex incentive, very cumbersome business. Civil aspects of it was the most costly part of it. Today there are tower companies, infrastructure sharing. You don't necessarily need to own that heavy cost aspects. From a transmission point of view, again, there are open access players, there are bandwidth available from many alternative players. You can leverage from that, or on the back-end side, lots of data centers, carrier-neutral data centers are emerging. So all these aspects are making it much easier to get into that business. And definitely, I mean, Wi-Fi, white spectrum and all are very innovative, very demanded kind of technologies going forward, particularly on Wi-Fi. I mean, it's any device that you have today have Wi-Fi capability, probably it will be the case for other affordable technologies going forward as well. So in my opinion, yes, we will see more and more the dynamics and power shifting from current MNOs to more creative and innovative companies coming on the market with good proposals.
Just staying with you for a moment longer, there's been a lot of debate, particularly in South Africa in the last year, about OTT, over-the-top services like WhatsApp and Google Hangouts and all the other ones. You speak to the operators, and they actually warn that this is a threat to infrastructure investment. They say that they need to recoup their investment, and if they're not recouping that investment because it's all going, or the spend is all going to over-the-top players, that they won't be able to invest as much in the networks as they have in the past. Is that a real threat, or are they just making noise?
I believe, I mean, everybody really needs to reassess their position on the market and what their value proposition is, because inevitably, whatever you do, the things are happening. I mean, Google, they have MBN offering it today, getting into that space already. And today I was reading, it's more roaming is available on that in your home-based cost. Yeah. So it is happening, and the thing is how much you can block this, how much you can complain about this is limited time. So you just really need to define what your value proposition is, where you are positioning in the market, and take it from there. And I believe sharing not only telecom space today over tops. If you think about the likes of Uber, Airbnb, and all, it's all sharing transport resources, sharing your real estate resource, and it's finding lots of success. So I think it's inevitable, and because these are really bringing value to the consumers and demanded by the consumers, so you cannot just stand in front of the consumer demand.
Okay. I must just mention, just as an amusing aside, I had lots of conversations with the big telco operators in South Africa, maybe even as recently as 3 years ago, and they were all insistent that there's no business case in South Africa for FTTH. Suddenly, one startup in the form of Vumatel came along and started rolling out, and suddenly there was a business case, and they were all in a race to roll out FTTH. I thought it was quite interesting. Riaan, let me bring you in with my next question. What, in your view, can both governments and regulators do to enable a better and broader connectivity picture in Africa?
I think they should speed up the process.
Yeah.
we can't afford to take 5 years to decide what to do with an LTE license.
Right.
I'm sorry, we just can't. So, the more proactive government approaches this, the better industry can respond and introduce services to the mass, which are demanding and in need of connectivity. So again, it's a case of, if you have a look at a country like East Africa, in my view, they are significantly more dynamic than we are from a regulatory perspective. They are embracing the requirements from industry at large, and they are accommodating and trying to understand how to, as quickly and efficiently as possible, introduce sensible legislation enabling connectivity to the mass. And I think again, we need to make sure that we have to become more proactive. We're just not.
I was very interested to see that the Nigerian Communications Commission, which has been more in the news for the MTN fine more than anything else lately, but I see recently they've started allocating spectrum in the 2.6 and digital dividend bands, whereas here in South Africa we're still having a big argument about digital TV. Yeah. So I guess it's frustrating. Just on the subject of spectrum, though, you're in the Wi-Fi game.
Yeah.
Should we be opening up more spectrum for Wi-Fi type applications? Can we do that?
I think we can, and I think we should. Again, the end goal here is to ensure that there's cost-effective quality connectivity to all, affordable, reliable, and it serves a need. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a clear understanding as to, for instance, with the mobile operators starting to look at LTEU, for instance.
Yeah.
Where are they going to play? Are they going to encroach into the traditional Wi-Fi space? Do we really want that? Wi-Fi traditionally has always been perceived as it's a commodity. You kind of expect to have, you want Wi-Fi everywhere. So we need to embrace and motivate and try and push for legislation to enable us to ensure that we can deliver connectivity quicker.
Yeah.
Just we need to catch a wake up.
Yeah. Catch a wake up. So
we've got everything we need.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
I think we, as a country, as an industry, we've got everything we need. We just need to be able to go and do it.
Great. So, Luke, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in Africa. If you look at, Cape Town, Joburg, Kigali, Nairobi, there's lots of interesting telecommunications developments happening. I never thought we'd see FTTH in Lusaka, for example. But what about the smaller towns and villages? I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people living in rural areas in places where there is probably no mobile connectivity, and if there is, it's probably a 2G connection. What hope does the rural Transkei have of being connected, or a village in the DRC? Is it all going to be mobile eventually, or are we going to be using Google's balloons?
So actually, one of Google's balloons landed in the Karoo. It fell out of the sky and unfortunately destroyed somebody's chicken coop. I never thought I'd receive an invoice from a farmer in the Karoo for compensating him for his chicken coop. But nonetheless, the point is that I suppose that the balloons do fly where you put them. So yes, it does seem like a far-fetched and typically sort of, I suppose, almost sci-fi kind of solution to this particular problem. But it's been tried and tested in a number of different locations at the moment, and we're playing with a variety of different commercial models that enable us to partner with operators in particular to reach consumers. So I think it's highly likely that there are opportunities for much more creative ways of connecting people than are currently the case. But I think even before you get to those really creative ways, just like the other panelists have said, we have an enormous case just to move a lot more quickly with things that are much closer to home. Google ran a TV whitespace project in Cape Town just to prove that we could deliver this in the South African environment. The project was very successful on its own terms. We presented these to ICASA over 2 years ago.
Sure.
And to a large extent, I think we were very willing to continue the experiment at much larger scale.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to do that if you don't have a coalition of the willing that includes the government and making the regulatory changes that we need to make. So I think if we're able to move at pace we'll be able to do a lot more for the people that typically don't get serviced by using TV white space on the one hand, and perhaps in a few years' time, you never know, we might find a few more balloons on chicken coops.
Good stuff. I look forward to that. Bora, let me bring you in. The price of smartphones has fallen dramatically, and they're within the reach of almost everyone now. I think India's just launched I don't know how good it is, but India's just launched a smartphone that costs 60 bucks, 60 rand. I think it's subsidized by advertising, but nonetheless, 60 rand cell phone is something quite remarkable. But, you know, connecting everyone in Africa is going to mean getting down to people who are earning $2 a day. Are we ever going to connect everybody? Is it possible? And if so, how do we do it?
Well, it's a challenge, right? I mean, the thing is, it's not a matter of technology. I think the technology is there, and you know, from TV white space to more efficient use of other wireless spectrum resources, to your energy sources, to your even very rapid deployment size, which is light and all. I mean, it's all available. It's not a matter of technology. It's really how we are getting this to the end user from affordable point of view. For end user devices, I mean, you are mentioning about 60 rand phone. The thing is, good, you can use that phone, but you really need to get that phone to support relevant content to the user of that phone.
Sure.
And it requires really your content to be in that form, which is meaningful to the end user. So again, I mean, this is really driving the demand side aspect of the things. And governments really, getting in there to make this more affordable from not on the supply side of the things, but governments probably needs to look into how they can cooperate with the private sector if there is an area which needs to be covered, rather than trying to do it yourself. Try to partner with the other industry players and probably create the demand by being an anchor over there, right? And then it opens up the opportunity for others to benefit from that. So there is a lot to be done over there. Still, there is not enough coordination and cooperation on that space. And then again, for me, the most important thing is not necessarily technology or end device. It's really making internet useful or meaningful to the end users. And as long as we create the demand, then it will be somehow become economically or commercially viable.
Thanks, Bora. I think at that point, I've got a couple more questions, but I think we are running a bit low on time. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. Any of the journalists here have any questions, or anyone more broadly? I think there is a roving mic.
Thank you, Duncan. Great conversation, gentlemen. My name is Owen. I'm the CTO for Kakono Technologies. We are a startup tech, but doing relatively well, thank you. The conversation around why South Africa is a bit behind East Africa in terms of the policy and ideologies around how do we progress, I think, are based around competition. The East African region, I think, posts a lot more competition with Uganda and all the other countries around there in terms of who's going to be first to lead the regional economics. And so in South Africa, I mean, in Southern Africa, South Africa is a powerhouse over most other countries, and there is no pressure. So I think one has to look, or the government has to look beyond competitiveness only in the region, but competitiveness on a global and on a larger scale. In order to start saying that if we don't implement policies today, East Africa in a couple of years, we won't have to worry about Nigeria so much. It will be East Africa and Nigeria. So I think we need to instill an idealism and a conversation around, once we don't have to wait for competitiveness to build in the region. We just need to appreciate that we're in a global economy, and Google is not necessarily a South African company, but it's a global company. Uber is a similar thing. But if you look at the revenue of those businesses in South Africa alone, it's phenomenal. So we got to look beyond the region. Okay.
Great. So anyone on the panel who you wanted specifically to react to that, or was it just a statement that you wanted to make? Okay, thank you. Any further questions?
Okay, so my question is to get an opinion from the panelists, especially when it comes to the discussion around OTTs and how to respond. Would it be a case of, between the comms and let's call it the media players or digital media players to try and increase the consumer's wallet share on those types of services instead of trying to fight for a fixed share of the consumer? Because it looks like, the telcos are saying, okay, if a consumer is spending $100, we should at least make $50 of that. Why not work towards making consumers spend $150 over it? So I just want to get your opinion around that kind of viewpoint in terms of addressing the issue with OTTs. Thank you.
Bora, do you want to pick this one up?
Sure. I guess at the end of the day, consumer who drives the market, consumer is the king, right? I mean, and today most MNOs have that relationship more intense than OTTs. I mean, so it is just that how you leverage that and how you really make sure you retain that relation with your consumers rather than getting an OTT coming onto market and stealing your consumers. So it is a tough question. I mean, it is a tough question, but at the end of the day, you really need to listen to consumer and you really need to address their needs on a economic, where it makes economic sense and on the basis of what they demand. For example, I mean, FTTH is a very, very good example to that. Most of the large incumbents in this country have resisted so long not to get in there, including Telkom probably, pushing DSL for so long and not really getting in that space. What happened? I mean, 2 years ago, one creative IT came over there. Today, everybody is panicking about it from an incumbent's point of view. So you really need to not be defensive around what's going on the market. You need to find your value offering on that, and you are in a good space from an MNO point of view. You have still that intense relationship with your consumer. How you leverage it? How you then, not if you want to avoid an OTT threat, how you replace it with your offerings, I think should be the answer on that.
I mean, Luke, Google's arguably the biggest, baddest OTT of them all. Should the telcos be scared of you?
I'm just gauging the mood of the audience before I answer. No, look, I think probably the most positive thing that we can do is to work together to increase the size of the audience that we're dealing with. And I don't think that's impossible to do, particularly in South Africa. What we would probably say is that consumers are way ahead of all of us. Whether you're Google or you're providing some sort of data connectivity, the consumer is going to decide what they do with that product. And there's some really good examples. Let's say, for instance, I'm streaming on my fibre to the home connection a YouTube video on my phone, which I then cast to my television using Chromecast. Now, what are all of the different connections that are made there? Now, you've got fibre to the home, which is provisioned by, potentially a combination of 2 or 3 different people. You've got a phone that's provisioned by probably MTN or Vodacom or whoever else. There are other providers out there. And you've got a Chromecast, which is a device made by Google, which you use to distribute that to your television. Now, from a consumer's point of view, that's quite a complicated set of use cases, or a complicated way of connecting all of your devices and using your connectivity. But for their point of view, it should be simple and should be seamless. And it works because all of those devices and all of that connectivity it works together. It's interoperable one way or another. And that's the way we're going to grow the market, is by making more interoperable opportunities for consumers to use that and to use and view content when and where they want to. Now, if we do that, everybody thrives. But where there are barriers, it's incredibly difficult for any one provider to grow. So I think if we can focus more on getting our heads around how we grow that ecosystem and how we make sure that everybody's able to consume what they want to, when they want to, and pay for it for that matter, in a way that's convenient, there's an opportunity for everybody to win in the equation.
Thanks. There was a question in the front here, over here.
Hi. There's been a lot of talk around the triple bottom line and servicing the bottom of the pyramid, particularly East Africa and also here because of the sheer numbers and the volume that comes with servicing the bottom of the pyramid. And I'm in particular looking at the likes of Google. when do you stop and actually measure the social impact? Have you, in the initiatives that you've put in place, and I know there was a discussion around education and what you've done there, when do you stop and actually measure the social impact to see that it's not merely about the profit, but that it's actually impacting the community and the economic development positively?
Well, I think, the point is that in the example that I use, that profitable businesses employ more people. And it's not just for the sake of profit. It's about the fact that we have enormous unemployment in South Africa, as we do in the rest of Africa. And what we need to do is to create an environment where not only do people have the skills that enable them to contribute to this particular economy, but that we create businesses that can employ people who have these skills. And by doing so, we hopefully will grow a thriving ecosystem where there are many participants that all play an important role. So I think that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are a number of ways in which connectivity goes well beyond commerce and well beyond profit. And I think there, for instance, just the sheer ability to distribute content from an educational perspective, whether in fact that's aimed at schools or students, or of the type that is perhaps related to health. Or even just government services. How do you access government services? There's an enormous role for different organizations, possibly with Google, to play in distributing content to people who have both internet connected and connected to the internet devices. So I think there's an enormous amount that can be done. We're trying to do our little bit in terms of the education programs that we're involved in at the moment, and there are a variety of others that also involve developers, for instance, actually going a little bit more deeper into digital skills so that we don't just create content, but we actually build platforms. And I think that's also very important. And it's the only way we're going to actually create a Google or a Facebook in Africa is to move beyond sheer content creation and get into actually platform creation. And I think that's possibly the next step for us. But without the digital skills in the first place, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to maintain the kind of competitiveness we need to create platforms that will be adopted at the scale of a Google or a WhatsApp, for that matter.
Let's go to the back of the room. I see there's a question from Adam Oxford there.
Hi, Adam Oxford from HGXC Africa. I've got a question for Riaan. You touched on the subject of LTEU, and I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit about how it threatens your business. Because are you talking about a technical issue with it changing Wi-Fi from being a commodity, or are there commercial and regulatory problems that you foresee?
Well, look, at this point in time, there's no standard yet, right? So the standard needs to be ratified. And I guess, that is kind of where we need to understand. Surely there's an established playing field where Wi-Fi has been servicing globally for a number of years. It's proven itself, and this is where it exists. And I think what clearly needs to happen is there needs to be some decent thought put into the like of LTEU. Okay, where do the operators intend to utilize that? And I think ultimately I see it as a complementary service, I would hope, and not a competing technology, because ultimately then you would be moving into a scenario where the MNOs would be owning pretty much any connectivity device, which would just be disastrous. So I think that in my view it's definitely complementary in nature. However, because the standard's not ratified as yet, we're going to have to wait and see, and I suspect that's probably going to take another 24 months or so before it's done and dusted. But ultimately, I think it's a complementary service where both would be able to live in an ecosystem together fairly happily.
Great. I think we've got time for two more questions. Hans van der Groenendaal in the front here, and do we have another question after that? One more, yes, over there. All right, let's go with Hans first.
Thanks, Duncan. I think Riaan may be the one that should answer the question. Or I think where the big problem now is that we are waiting for a white paper on broadband, which basically has to tell us where and how we're going to allocate more spectrum, because that's where we are stuck. I've noticed industry become extremely quiet lately, and I don't see any mass like action. Like we have mass action for everything we do in this country, but we don't seem to have mass action from industry to say to the minister, hey, get off your butt now. You know, it's now like 2 years behind schedule. Digital dividend is not going to happen because even if they actually agreed now, it's going to take about 7 years before you can get that spectrum. So shouldn't industry like rise now and become more vocal?
Well, I think they have been, to be fair. They really have. And I think the biggest frustration is the amount of time it's taken to actually get this almost released document out. By the time it's released, it's out of date. And my biggest concern is that we're effectively going to miss the whole LTE boat. Okay? And we're going to end up having to redo this to address the 5G that's around the corner. By 2019, 5G is upon us, right? And then do we have to go through this whole process again, take another 5 to 7 years to get a policy document in place? And that's kind of where the frustration comes in. We need to somehow engage with government collectively, and we need to really, work this. There's no ways this is way too reactive, and the technology is not going to wait for us. Quite frankly, the world's not going to wait. And we are competing in a global economy today, right? So I don't know if you guys agree, but from my point of view, is this should be driven. This is the the lifeblood of our economy going forward. For every 10% of ICT connectivity that's introduced into a country, you grow the GDP by 1%. That's been proven, right? We can do with that right now.
I think what's even more concerning is, we're more than a year now past the deadline to switch to digital TV, and we haven't even switched on digital broadcast for the dual illumination period. So we're way behind, way behind. There was a last question over here somewhere, I think.
Good day, everyone. My name is Mpho Moyo. I'm an independent analyst and consultant. I just wanted to know from the panelists, what are the opportunities currently in the digital space for telcos? Thank you.
Bora, do you want to have a go stab at that one?
I guess, if you talk about, first I'll talk a bit about South Africa and Africa. In South Africa, in line with the previous question, obviously we have this, bottleneck of spectrum, right? And we know that digital migration will take a while, even the spectrum is allocated or put to use. So that creates an opportunity within itself for telcos because, okay, it is a problem. It's an important resource to get connectivity to many, but it also creates an opportunity for many other telcos to go about creatively. In meanwhile, you know that for next 3 to 4 years, you will not have that spectrum in large use. So what do you do? Rather than lamenting around the issue, what do you do to bring the connectivity to more? And probably fiber to home is one good example where it makes commercial sense. But on other areas, we have seen some other recent players, mixing their fiber offering with some, different wireless last mile technologies, taking us to second and third tier towns, and it creates an opportunity for challengers or newcomers on the market, or even smaller players stepping up. So that's one. In Africa, I guess where the spectrum issue is less of a trouble. Because there are countries who are moving well on the digital migration point of view. There, again, the policy becomes an important matter, how you really put that spectrum into use and to connect to unconnected. And, from regulators' point of view, there's a really good case over there to go about it creatively and ensuring that spectrum is used for connecting the unconnected rather than just going and raising money out of it, which in the long run may not be the best opportunity. From telco's point of view, in Africa today, the opportunities are endless because today one thing happened within the last 6 years in Africa, which I was talking about, infrastructure sharing. More and more infrastructure sharing is available, from tower costs, fiber to your data centers. It is there. So to get onto the business, it's not that big of a challenge. And there are companies today who is leading on that way. I mean, we have lots of examples in Uganda, Ghana, and a few other places, likes of Smile, Afrimax, and Surfline, and all these newcomers. And it's not a big trouble for them to get into the business and make a business case out of that and raise even funding, because these are kind of appealing business cases. So if you really, look carefully and take advantage of how the industry is evolving, I think there is clear business case and opportunities for newcomers. From incumbents' point of view, again, I mean, they really need to redefine their position on the market, given that, I mean, there are no more, particularly talking about service providers, they are no more differentiating their service from a coverage or infrastructure point of view. And there is, pressure on the OTTs. How you really define your role in the industry, and, how you keep your relationship or, capture base from a consumer point of view and leverage it. So I think that's the real question for incumbent players on the market.
I think just following up from that question, one of the questions that I think is interesting is whether the big telco operators should be trying to compete with the likes of Google and Facebook and others with apps of their own, internet services of their own. Is it a space they know? Is it a space they can get to know? And do they have the right cultures to even attempt something like that? Is it something they should be doing, or should they be sticking to their knitting as providers of connectivity?
Well, I believe, I mean, they should be getting closer to that space, because providers of connectivity today is becoming less of an important matter in service delivery. Mm-hmm. Today we have, as I said, I mean, apart from the passive infrastructure, on the active side of the things, we have lots of new technologies coming up. We have cloud, we have SD and NFV, software-defined networks, network function virtualization. All those things are making all the hassles of operating a network, taking this away from the service providers today. So what they are left with is their relationship with the end users. So that's exactly where the OTTs are coming in. So if they are not to get closer to that value proposition, it will be very difficult for them to compete.
Great stuff. Well, I hope that's given everyone a small taste of what's coming up at AfricaCom. Bora, Rian, Luke, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today, and hope to see you all at, what's it called, the festival in November.